Hello everybody, I'm Robert Franz, music director of the Windsor Symphony Orchestra, and I am here today with our principal cellist, Andrew McIntosh. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
So we're chatting today because I want to find out more about you as a musician.
Okay.
But also, you're going to be a soloist with us at our November Masterworks, performing the second cello concerto by Victor Herbert.
That's correct.
So I want to talk about that as well.
Okay.
How did it all start for you? When did you start playing the cello? How did you know you were interested in it? How did that all happen?
I started when I was 10. I went to a middle school that had a string program. Mm-hmm. So I was a little too big for the violin, so they stuck me with the cello, and I've stuck with it ever since.
Did you love it? Was it love at first sight?
Absolutely, yeah. It was. I remember the first time we played a G major scale with the whole string group, and it was something pretty spectacular. So.
And did you grow up in a family where, like, were you taking, like, did they love classical music too? Were you taking private lessons? How was your?
My parents were into music, but more kind of folk music scene at that time. And my dad liked classical music, so there was the odd record here and there that I could listen to. And yeah, we just kind of, it was more of a school thing growing up, and it just kind of kept going from that. After the middle school, I joined the youth orchestra in London, and then ended up going to the university there for a couple of years.
Do you remember, was there a moment when you said, okay, I want to do this for a living, like I'm really this committed to it?
When I was 16, I thought it'd be great to be a musician. You travel the world and do all these wonderful things. And I remember around the end of my undergrad at McGill when I realized, ooh, I better go somewhere and really start practicing hard, because if this is going to be my career, I better get in shape. So when I went to Cleveland, that's when I practiced like a crazy person. What does
that look like for somebody who's like at a master's degree level studying an instrument? When you say you have practiced like crazy, like how many hours a day? Like what's that process like?
It was like an 8-hour day of practicing and then trying to fit in classes. But you'd wake up at 6:30, 7 o'clock and have breakfast, and I would sit there with a pot of tea and practice till noon. And so you just, it was also more condensed. Instead, some people take a couple of years. I did in a year and a half for various reasons. And so there was a lot of stuff that I had to.
Were you ever worried about injuries? Or did you have injuries?
I strained myself from time to time, but not really. I'm also kind of athletic. Mm-hmm. And I think just with the cello, it's a little more physical.
Right.
And so I was a little more adapted.
Also, wouldn't you say the cello is probably a little bit more ergonomically friendly than, say, like a violin or a viola?
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely.
It's not like you have to do in bass too. Like it's very much of the string instruments. I think the one that fits the human body the best.
If you can sit down and put it on the floor and play it, that's a good instrument.
So, okay, so you graduated from the Cleveland Institute of Music, and then what happened? What happened after that?
I went back to Toronto and started auditioning, and that's when I won the job here, April of 97. Long time ago.
Been a few years.
Yeah, and then stayed in Toronto for a while, freelanced, and eventually I won a job with the National Ballet Orchestra there, and so I've kind of juggled the two ever since.
And what is that like for you? So you, what is the difference between like playing in the pit all the time at the National Ballet and playing here on stage?
It's definitely a different feeling when you're on stage. It's more of a visual thing. You're aware of the audience, mm-hmm. Whereas in the pit, you don't see the dancers. You can kind of see the audience, but not that much, and so it's a little more insulated kind of experience.
So you feel like maybe you're not as connected with all the other components. It's a little bit more challenging to be connected to all the components, I would imagine.
It is, yeah.
And so talk to us a little bit about being principal of the WSO. What does that entail? What does that feel like for an audience member who sees you and they see you front and center, because you're facing out to the audience directly. And many of our audience members have known you for decades now.
Yes.
Which is awesome. What is that experience like for you?
It's a wonderful group to play in, a good camaraderie with all the other principals, all of the members of the orchestra. It's like we're a big family, so it's fun. I enjoy the leadership role. It's kind of, you're leading the bass line between Greg and myself, mm-hmm. And we're trying to fit in with other sections and with the rest of the strings and with the winds and stuff like that. So it's challenging in that way to kind of try and keep everything together, keep the inner rhythms going, and have the odd melody, and yeah.
It's sort of an interesting component too, because I don't know if everybody is sort of aware of sort of the role that the cello bass line plays in making sure that the symphony kind of stays together. Because most of the time you don't get the big hip tunes that the first violins get.
Right.
But without you guys, the firsts would be swimming.
Right, we're the boom. And then there's the chuck. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Which would be the violas, of
Right.
course.
Well, yes. So yeah, it's definitely it's fun to try and figure out how to place those moments so people can play off of your playing. It's fun.
So this isn't your first rodeo with playing a concerto with the orchestra, obviously, but when I asked you about this a couple of years ago, and I think we've been talking about this since before COVID now, actually, Victor Herbert's second cello concerto, I think, is probably one of the great cello concertos in the repertoire. It's an amazing piece that I don't think gets performed anywhere near as much as, like, say, the Dvořák cello concerto or the Tchaikovsky Rococo variations. Talk to me a little bit about what this piece means to you and how you attack it.
It was, I guess, it inspired Dvořák to write his concerto, and it's kind of referred to as like a mini Dvořák concerto. It's not divided up into 3 movements; it's all one continuous thing. So that's kind of interesting. To me, the slow movement is like the 5-star moment. There's a little bit at the beginning. It's just as wonderful,
Yeah.
and there's a beautiful melody. It's about maybe 4 measures long, and that is like the center of the piece. Around that is all these other things that you have to do in order to play that beautiful piece. So that's what I'm working on, the bits that are around it. So it starts off very dramatic, much like the Dvořák concerto.
Mm-hmm.
The last movement is fun, scherzo-like.
Yeah.
So it should be it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge for me personally, in many ways. To
Take us a little deeper into that challenge, because I'm curious to know. I mean, I know as a conductor as well, there are certain pieces that just sort of, you're like, oh, you look at it, you're like, I get how this works. And certain pieces, you're like, okay, this is going to take a little woodshedding.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about that process. What is that process like for you?
Well, for most orchestral stuff, you get the music and you can prepare it in a couple weeks, or and you might have the odd solo here and there, or a melody line. To be featured for 23 minutes is a lot of soloing, so there's a lot more preparation that goes into that. So I have a little spot in our house in the attic that is a nice little a little practice room for me, so I'm up there often.
Are you like, do you have a game plan?
I keep setting targets, and I almost meet them. So I set another one, but I think we're in pretty good shape for November 18th.
Yes.
So it's going to be busy.
Yeah.
But it's a great challenge, and it's a beautiful piece. And the first time I heard it was back in Lancaster in 1997.
Okay. And what did you think your first hearing?
I thought it was fantastic. It was amazing. It was beautiful. So.
It's one of the interesting things about it for me is that you're right about the pyrotechnics in the first and the third movement, but it really does sort of connect up with his love of operetta. I mean, Victor Herbert was obviously most well known for writing Babes in Toyland and Naughty Marietta and The Red Mill and things like that. And he was on Broadway all the time and writing these show tunes and these hip tunes. And it does kind of have a little bit of that feel to it sometimes.
Yeah.
But then it has this sort of like circus almost atmosphere in places.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is kind of interesting about the piece, and I'm interested in your take on it, is that there are a lot of what we would call rhythmic ambiguities in it. Like, it doesn't exactly sound the way it looks on the page, as I'm sort of studying it myself for the first time, because I've never conducted it. This will be my first time through. How do you sort of deal with some of those? Because it doesn't just go, although it sounds like it does to the audience, but on the page, it's a little bit different.
Yeah. It's definitely very vocal, I think. So there'll be like a 4-measure phrase, and then different sections within the piece. There's some concertos that you can play, like a Haydn concerto that is pretty square, and you play through the thing, and that's how it goes. This has a lot more rubato and tempo changes and things like that. And yeah, it's it's definitely challenging.
Yeah.
So,
What would you say, my final question is, what would you say as sort of one of the youngest elder statesmen in the orchestra, being been in the orchestra for over a couple of decades now, what would you say you've seen as the sort of biggest growth or progression in the orchestra over the last couple of decades?
the youngest?
Elder
Oldest? The
statesman.
elder statesman. Okay.
I just wanted to put it in context.
Yeah. It's definitely, I think it has matured as a group. I think it's definitely gone through, like before I came here, had gone through this massive expansion, and then it kind of dwindled a little bit. But I think ever since I've joined, it's been a pretty solid, steady upward trend, minus a few glitches. And I think having a place in the Capitol Theatre to call home definitely helps. Yeah, so I think it's doing quite well.
From your perspective, I tell people this all the time, but I'd like to know from your perspective, having our own theater like this, what does that mean to the musicians in the orchestra, that we get to rehearse on stage, perform on stage, always in the same acoustic?
It's definitely a major plus. It's a major plus. It feels like a home, so that's important. I think just for stability, and you know what to expect when you go into a rehearsal or a performance. So,
well, thank you so much for joining me today, and we're really looking forward to this
My pleasure.
performance together.
My pleasure.
All right.
All right.
Thanks.
Take care.